A warning to our viewers. What you're about to watch is a true story. The following program contains content that some viewers may find disturbing. Viewer discretion is strongly advised.
For less than a month, he'd been living with dancer Monika Beerle. But Beerle wanted Rakowitz to move out. The former homeless man refused to leave. The dispute infuriated Rakowitz.
Because I was really angry at that point.
And you'd been angry for a long time, hadn't you?
Yeah, she was getting me angrier, and angrier every day.
In this apartment, he killed Monika, then carefully butchered her body, boiled her bones, and allegedly fed her flesh to homeless people in the park.
August 1989, New York City. In the shadowy corners of Tompkins Square Park, homeless residents gratefully accepted bowls of hot soup from a wild-haired man who called himself a prophet. They had no way of knowing that the generous stranger ladling out their meal had just committed one of the most horrifying acts of cannibalism in New York's history. As they savored what they believed was chicken soup, Daniel Rakowitz watched with satisfaction, knowing that the meat floating in their bowls was actually the boiled remains of 26-year-old Swiss dancer Monika Beerle, a woman he had brutally murdered, dismembered in a bathtub, and transformed into his grotesque feast of human flesh. What those desperate souls were consuming wasn't just soup. It was evidence of a crime so depraved that it would forever change how America viewed the thin line between madness and evil. Welcome to the Shadow Files crime series. Tonight's case will shake you to your core. Take a moment to hit subscribe, drop a like, and please let us know where you're watching from. And now, we begin. This nightmare unfolded in the late 1980s in New York City's East Village, a neighborhood that existed as a powder keg of contradictions. While Wall Street boomed just miles away, the streets of Alphabet City were ruled by squatters, punk rockers, drug dealers, and those society had completely forgotten. Tompkins Square Park had transformed into what locals called Tent City, a sprawling homeless encampment where over 150 people lived in makeshift shelters of cardboard and tarp. Punk music blasted through the night, needles littered the ground, and the city's most desperate souls sought refuge in this urban wasteland that the authorities had essentially abandoned. This was an era before cell phones, before social media, before anyone could instantly call for help or alert the world to danger. Someone could disappear, and it might take weeks for anyone to notice. It was a time when mental illness went largely untreated, when the line between harmless eccentric and dangerous predator was often impossible to distinguish until it was far too late. In this forgotten corner of America, a man carrying a live rooster and harboring delusions of godhood would commit an act so heinous that it would become the stuff of New York legend. A crime that marked the absolute nadir of the neighborhood's descent into chaos. Now, before we continue, again I must warn you, what you're about to hear is the true account of a real crime that horrified New York City. This story contains graphic descriptions of violence, murder, and cannibalism. Some viewers may find this content deeply disturbing. Viewer discretion is, once again, strongly advised. 26-year-old Monica Beerle was everything the American dream represented to a young woman from small-town Switzerland. Born in St. Gallen, a picturesque city nestled in the Swiss Alps, she had traded the safety of her homeland for the electric promise of New York City. Monika had come to America with one burning ambition: to study at the prestigious Martha Graham Center of Contemporary Dance, where legends were made and careers launched. But dreams, in New York, came with a price. To survive while pursuing her passion, Monika worked nights as a dancer at Billy's Topless, a job that paid the bills but was worlds away from the artistic expression she craved. Those who knew her described Monika as quiet, almost withdrawn, the nicest person you'd ever meet, according to friends. She shared a cramped East Village apartment with several other young dreamers, all trying to make it in a city that chewed up and spat out the unprepared. In early August 1989, fate intervened in the worst possible way. Monika was in Tompkins Square Park when she encountered Daniel Rakowitz, sharing a joint in what seemed like a harmless moment between two East Village residents. When Daniel mentioned he desperately needed a place to stay, Monika made a decision that would cost her everything. She agreed to let him move into her apartment. It was supposed to be temporary, just friends helping friends, the way things worked in their community. Monika made it clear this was not a romantic arrangement, just someone offering shelter to another lost soul in the urban wilderness. But Daniel Rakowitz had very different ideas about their relationship. In those final weeks of her life, Monika struggled to balance her demanding dance classes, her exhausting night job, and an increasingly unstable roommate whose behavior grew more erratic with each passing day. Friends later said she seemed worried, even frightened. But in a neighborhood where everyone had their demons, Monika's concerns didn't seem exceptional. She had no way of knowing she was living with a ticking time bomb. Daniel Paul Rakowitz entered the world in 1960 at Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, where his father worked as a criminal investigator for the U.S. Army. But Daniel's childhood was shattered when he was just 2 years old. His mother suffered a fatal heart attack, and the toddler was found hours later, alone with her lifeless body. This traumatic beginning would haunt him forever. Raised by his sheriff father in small-town Texas, Daniel showed early signs of severe mental disturbance. By age 22, he had married a 14-year-old girl in what friends described as a deeply disturbing relationship. His young bride would later testify in court about the horrors she endured, describing how Daniel would chain her to the refrigerator when he left for work, claiming she had requested this treatment. But the physical restraint was only the beginning. When questioned about killing animals and committing acts of violence against women, Daniel's past painted a clear picture of escalating brutality. In chilling testimony, she revealed that Daniel had bragged to her about his previous acts of violence, how he had decapitated a dog with cold precision, how he had strangled a prostitute and watched the life drain from her eyes, and how he had used a screwdriver to gouge out a woman's eye from its socket. These weren't drunken boasts or idle threats. They were detailed confessions delivered with the matter-of-fact tone of someone describing routine tasks. The pattern was unmistakable. Daniel's violence was methodical, sexual in nature, and targeted the most vulnerable victims he could find: animals, children, sex workers, those who had little voice and even less protection. Each act seemed to feed his appetite for the next, more savage encounter. It was this escalating trail of brutality that finally forced Daniel to flee Texas in 1985. The violent incidents that drove him from his hometown weren't isolated outbursts of a troubled man. They were the calculated experiments of a predator perfecting his craft, learning what it felt like to hold absolute power over life and death. By 1985, after a series of violent incidents in Texas, Daniel fled to New York City, drawn to the East Village's tolerance for outcasts and misfits. He was 25 years old and carried with him a lifetime of trauma, mental illness, and violent tendencies that had never been properly addressed. In the East Village, Daniel Rakowitz became a neighborhood fixture, impossible to ignore. Known to everyone as the Chicken Man, he could be seen wandering the streets carrying a live rooster, often perched on his shoulder or sticking out of his backpack. His wild blonde hair, scraggly beard, and 70s-era clothes made him stand out even in a neighborhood that celebrated eccentricity. Daniel founded his own religion, which he called the Church of 966. He believed that while the biblical number 666 represented Satan, the devil had evolved through the generations and was now represented by 966. As his calling card, Daniel would scrawl this number on walls throughout the neighborhood, using chicken blood, marking his territory like some deranged urban prophet. He supported himself dealing marijuana and methamphetamines in Tompkins Square Park, all while preaching about the power of Satan, government overthrow, and animal sacrifice. Daniel believed he was God incarnate, destined to become the youngest person ever elected to the U.S. presidency. His delusions knew no bounds. But there was another side to Daniel that made him particularly dangerous. His apparent acts of kindness. He regularly cooked large pots of food to serve the homeless population of Tompkins Square Park. No one could have imagined that this seemingly generous gesture would one day become the vehicle for his most horrific crime. In August 1989, Monika Beerle made what seemed like a simple act of kindness. She allowed Daniel Rakowitz to move into her shared East Village apartment. What she saw as a temporary arrangement to help someone in need, Daniel immediately interpreted as something far more significant. In his delusional mind, they were now romantic partners, lovers destined to be together. The reality couldn't have been more different. For Monika, Daniel was simply a roommate helping with rent in an expensive city. But Daniel's behavior quickly became impossible to ignore. Other residents were disturbed by his bizarre religious rants about Satan and animal sacrifice, his constant preaching about his Church of 966, and his increasingly possessive behavior toward Monika. The volatile dynamics between his delusions and her attempts at maintaining normalcy created a powder keg in the small apartment. After just 16 days of living together, Monika reached her breaking point. She told Daniel he had to leave. A decision that would seal her fate. For a man with a documented history of violence against women, rejection was intolerable. Friends later said Monika seemed genuinely scared in those final days. But in a neighborhood where everyone had problems, she didn't know where to turn for help. The final argument began like so many others. Daniel's refusal to accept that their relationship existed only in his mind. Monika's firm insistence that he move out, but this time, Daniel's rage would cross a line from which there was no return. What should have been a simple conversation about living arrangements became the prelude to unthinkable horror. As we go into the most chilling details of this documentary, take a brief moment to like and subscribe to our channel if you haven't already, for more in-depth investigations and analysis of significant cases like this. On August 19, 1989, the confrontation that had been building for days finally erupted. Monika made her final stand for independence, demanding that Daniel leave her apartment and her life. But Daniel Rakowitz had other plans.
I went ahead and just punched her.
Where'd you punch her?
Right in the throat.
You punch her hard?
Yeah.
As hard as you've ever punched anybody before?
Yeah, well, one time I had a fight with like 19 guys, and then I was punching pretty well too.
In a moment of explosive violence, Daniel struck Monika in the throat with such brutal force that it crushed her windpipe and killed her almost instantly. Some accounts suggest an even more savage attack, that he stabbed her over 30 times with a carving knife while she was in the bathtub, her life draining away as she fought desperately for survival. In that horrific moment, a young woman's dreams of becoming a professional dancer died with her. The small-town Swiss girl who had traveled thousands of miles to pursue her passion in America became the victim of a monster who had been hiding in plain sight. Monika Beerle was 26 years old, and her life was over. What happened next defied human comprehension. Rather than fleeing or calling for help, Daniel Rakowitz began a methodical process of dismemberment that revealed either careful planning or terrifying instinct. Using skills he had learned working in restaurant kitchens, he drained the blood from Monika's body and began the systematic process of separating bones from flesh. The apartment bathtub became his workspace as he carved up the woman who had shown him kindness. Then came the most horrific part. Daniel moved his grisly operation to the kitchen, where he began boiling Monika's remains in large pots on the stove, turning human flesh into what he would later call soup. A detailed diagram that Daniel later drew for psychiatrists and presented in court showed the methodical nature of his butchery. Labeled with chilling precision were items like napkin with teeth, sawed in half leg bones, and hundreds of face pieces. For 10 full days, Daniel lived in this apartment of horrors, surrounded by the evidence of his unspeakable crime. Daniel's regular practice of cooking for the homeless population of Tompkins Square Park now took on a sinister new purpose. Armed with his grotesque soup, he returned to the park, where hungry, desperate people gratefully accepted what they believed was a charitable meal. Later, witnesses would testify to the horror of discovering human remains in their food. One homeless man found an unmistakable human fingertip floating in his bowl. When the truth eventually emerged, Daniel bragged about his cannibalistic creation with chilling pride. "I killed her and boiled her head. Then I made soup out of her brains. It tasted pretty good." The homeless community's reaction when they learned what they had consumed was one of absolute horror and rage. Some wanted to kill Daniel themselves when they realized they had unknowingly participated in his monstrous act of cannibalism. While distributing his human soup, Daniel still needed to dispose of the evidence. He placed Monika's skull and remaining bones in a bucket filled with kitty litter and stored it in a locker at the Port Authority bus terminal, a grotesque storage unit in one of the city's busiest transportation hubs. But perhaps most disturbing of all was Daniel's behavior in the weeks that followed. He continued walking through Tompkins Square Park with his pet rooster, openly bragging about the murder to anyone who would listen. The community's reaction was telling. They thought he was crazy, but surely not capable of something this monstrous. The most chilling moment came when a friend visited Daniel's apartment and made a discovery that would haunt her forever. There, simmering on the kitchen stove, was Monika's head. Paralyzed by the sheer horror of what she was seeing, she ran from the apartment, too traumatized to even think of calling police. For weeks, Daniel made open confessions about his crime, but in a neighborhood full of drug addicts, mentally ill individuals, and people prone to wild stories, no one took his claims seriously. The very community that had embraced Daniel as an eccentric character couldn't comprehend that their chicken man had become something far more dangerous, a cannibal killer hiding in plain sight. By September 1989, the rumors swirling around Tompkins Square Park had become too persistent to ignore. On September 8th, police finally began investigating reports of a missing woman and increasingly disturbing stories about Daniel Rakowitz's claims of murder. 5 days later, on September 13th, officers tracked Daniel down at a Brooklyn restaurant where he worked as a dishwasher. When confronted, his reaction was as chilling as it was unexpected. Daniel immediately confessed to the crime and offered to lead police directly to Monika's remains. The journey to the Port Authority bus terminal became a surreal procession as Daniel calmly guided detectives through one of the city's busiest transportation hubs to a storage locker he had rented. Inside, exactly as he had promised, police discovered a bucket filled with kitty litter and, floating within it, the unmistakable shape of a human skull and scattered bones. The evidence was so shocking that it made even hardened New York detectives physically ill. Here was proof that the neighborhood madman's wild boasts had been horrifyingly real. The chicken man, who had seemed like just another East Village eccentric, had actually committed one of the most depraved murders in the city's history. But the investigation would take an even darker turn. In 1992, 3 years after the murder, police reopened the case following reports that Daniel may not have acted alone. They began investigating possible connections to a drug-sex cult operating from an Eastville storefront called the Church of the Realized Fantasy. This bizarre organization, run by known drug dealer Michael Cesar, described itself as a communal marijuana sex church where members would use drugs together and engage in group sexual activities. Law enforcement suspected the cult may have assisted Daniel with Monika's murder as part of a satanic ritual, possibly inspired by the occult philosophy of Aleister Crowley. The investigation led to the arrest of Randy Easterday, a cult member who was charged with assisting in the crime. This development raised disturbing questions about whether Daniel's act of cannibalism was not the product of one man's madness, but part of a larger conspiracy involving ritual murder and satanic worship. When Daniel Rakowitz finally went on trial in February 1991, it became a media sensation that gripped New York City. The courtroom was packed as prosecutors and defense attorneys grappled with a fundamental question: was this man evil or insane? Daniel's behavior during the trial only added to the spectacle. He frequently interrupted proceedings with bizarre outbursts and, after the verdict was read, shocked everyone by telling the jury, I hope we can share a joint together someday." He even offered to smoke marijuana with the judge, who dismissed him with an embarrassed wave and called the entire proceeding a lulu. After 9 grueling days of deliberations, the jury struggled to comprehend the incomprehensible horror they had heard described in testimony. Psychiatric experts testified about Daniel's severe schizophrenia and long history of untreated mental illness, painting a picture of a man whose grip on reality had completely shattered. On February 22, 1991, the verdict was announced, not guilty by reason of insanity. Daniel's reaction to the verdict was as disturbing as everything else about his case. Rather than showing remorse, he promised the court he would sell a lot of marijuana to bring to justice the people who actually committed this crime. Still maintaining his innocence even after his detailed confession, he was immediately committed to the Kirby Forensic Psychiatric Center on Ward's Island, a maximum security facility for the criminally insane. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away in Switzerland, Monika's family learned the horrific details of their daughter's fate. A young woman who had traveled to America to pursue her dreams had instead become the victim of an unthinkable nightmare. The East Village community was forced to confront its darkest hour, realizing that their tolerance for eccentricity had allowed a monster to hide among them until it was too late. Daniel's commitment to Kirby was not permanent. New York state law required periodic reviews of his mental state, giving him opportunities to petition for release or transfer to a less secure facility. In 1995, he underwent his first sanity hearing, but the jury determined he was still too dangerous for release. Nearly a decade later, in 2004, another jury reviewed his case. This time they found Daniel was no longer dangerous, but concluded he remained severely mentally ill and should stay at Kirby. Throughout these proceedings, Daniel continued to maintain his innocence, spinning elaborate alternative theories about who really killed Monica. His ongoing claims and legal challenges have kept this case in the public eye for over 3 decades. The Daniel Rakowitz case became a symbol of the East Village's most dangerous era, a time when mental illness went untreated, when violence lurked behind bohemian facades, and when society's most vulnerable paid the ultimate price. The gentrification that transformed the neighborhood in subsequent decades was partly driven by crimes like this one. Where Tent City once sprawled across Tompkins Square Park, families now play safely with their children. The boutiques and restaurants that line the streets today would be unrecognizable to those who lived through the area's darkest days. But for those who remember, there are some things they can never forget, especially the homeless residents, who unknowingly consumed Daniel's horrific soup. And occasionally, modern Eastville residents make a chilling discovery. They're living in the very building where this unthinkable horror occurred, walking the same streets where a cannibal once roamed freely, serving human flesh to the hungry and desperate. Today, Daniel Rakowitz remains at Kirby Forensic Psychiatric Center, where he's been held for over 3 decades. At 64 years old, he continues to petition for release, continues to claim innocence, continues to blame others for the horrific crime that shocked New York City. Monika Beerle would have turned 61 this year. She came to America with dreams of becoming a professional dancer, of making art that would move people, of building a life far from her small Swiss hometown. Instead, she became the victim in one of the most disturbing cases in New York criminal history. The East Village of today bears little resemblance to the dangerous, chaotic neighborhood of 1989. Where once stood Tent City and Tompkins Square Park, now families play and couples walk their dogs. The boutiques and restaurants that line the streets would be unrecognizable to those who lived through the area's darkest days. But for those who remember, for those who were there, the horror of what Daniel Rakowitz did can never be fully erased. They remember a time when madness walked freely among them, when the line between eccentric neighbor and deadly predator was invisible, until it was too late. If you enjoyed this content, join our community by subscribing and turning on notifications. Every subscriber makes it possible for us to keep creating content we're passionate about sharing with you.
See, I actually even left out. I went to make a pot delivery of all things at Tompkins Square Park. And I came back like about 2 hours later, and she was still lying there.
She was still breathing?
No, then I touched her and she was cold.
That's when you realized she was dead?
That's when I realized she was dead.
What did you do then?
Then I was very fearful. And then I went ahead and did what I did.
What did you do?
The horribleness in which what I did to her. I dissected her body totally.